Thank you, Danny. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of Freedom Talk for inviting me to be here today. My topic of the day is carbon tax to stop climate emergency. Is that science or science fiction? I'd like to mention one thing before we get too far into this, and that is there was some talk previously about some of the challenges that Alberta faces. And I think that people should read the Nemeth reports, which are part of the Alberta Inquiry. And we have them posted on our blog for Friends of Science. Now, I do want to say that I am not representing Friends of Science today, even though I'm quite associated with them. This is my personal point of view. And so I will probably be drawing on some materials that I have acquired during my time working with Friends of Science, but these are my own personal views. So let's look at the mandate letter of the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So in the letter of January the 15th, 2021, part of the letter reads, "To be ready for what lies ahead, our government must continue to be agile and use the best available science and evidence. Canadians are counting on us to ensure that today's policies, programs, and services are calibrated and targeted to match their needs. Therefore, I, being the Prime Minister, expect you, being Minister Wilkinson, to uphold our ongoing commitment to delivering real results and effective government for the people we are elected to serve. We remain committed to evidence-based decision-making that takes into consideration the impacts of all policies on all Canadians and fully defends the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms." And if we go to the next slide, we can see the mandate letter to the Minister of Climate Change and Environment from December the 13th of 2019. It reads, "I also expect us to continue to raise the bar on openness and effectiveness and transparency in government. This means a government that is open by default. It means better digital capacity and services for Canadians. It means a strong and resilient public service. And it also means humility and continuing to acknowledge mistakes when we make them. Canadians do not expect us to be perfect, but they expect us to be diligent, honest, open, and sincere in our efforts to serve the public interest." So I hope you'll keep those things in mind as I go through the material in my presentation. And so the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what if a government's science is out of date or skewed? What if economic assumptions on carbon taxes are off? And what happens when the science relies on a singular theory with no public debate or cost-benefit analysis of the proposed objectives? So let's look at the Paris Agreement. What if the countries even managed to meet their Paris Agreement targets, which most of them are completely missing all their targets? Could you go back one? Thank you. So you'll see in the corner there, the graph is from Bjorn Lomborg. He's a Danish economist and climate policy analyst, and he's worked with hundreds of economists and scientists building the Copenhagen Consensus Center. He used the IPCC's favored magic model, and he found that if all the countries met their targets by 2030, the resulting reduction in warming by 2100 would be 0.05 degrees Celsius. And if they all continued to meet their targets, then by 2100, there would be 0.17 degrees Celsius reduction in warming. So that's 17/100ths of a degree, which is immeasurable. And the costs for that would be $1 to $2 trillion per year. So, you know, when it's this obvious that these are flawed policies and it's a flawed agreement, why would governments pursue such obviously ineffective and expensive goals? Well, It's because in the climate world, the reference point is what's known as the RCP 8.5 scenario, even though that's the least likely, and it's based on hopelessly out-of-date science. And we're not on that catastrophic pathway. So how can it be that a government or a society goes completely off the rails on a scientific question? Has it ever happened before? Well, yes, in the 60s, there was a thing called polywater, and polywater was discovered in the Soviet Union, and it appeared to be a kind of water that wouldn't freeze. And there became kind of a contest between the States and Russia for a short time, where people were trying to create their own polywater, almost like a space race. And engineers speculated that it might be good as antifreeze, and others were afraid that it would escape the lab and maybe melt all the ice caps and cause a disaster. Sound familiar? Anyway, they found out that it was just an error in the lab. There wasn't such a thing as polywater, but it had its own life and really took off, captured the imagination of thousands of people. And an example in medical research, what could that be aside from, well, we heard about COVID, and that would be, this is from Roger Pielke Jr.'s article, which I will go into further, but in the opening of it, he says, a 2015 literature review found almost 900 peer-reviewed studies published on breast cancer using a cell line derived from a breast cancer patient in Texas in 1976. But in 2007, it was confirmed that the cell line was actually a skin cancer line. Oops. A cursory search of Google Scholar indicates that the studies continued to be published until 2020, mistakenly using the skin cell in breast cancer research. So it does happen. It's not unusual. But the RCP 8.5 scenario, the scary catastrophic scenario, has proliferated largely because two green billionaires and a bunch of climate activists proliferated this report called Risky Business, wherein the RCP 8.5 became sort of known as the business as usual scenario, making everyone think, oh, there's a climate catastrophe coming. Now, if we look at that, if you look at the chart there, you can see how these RCPs, this is a representative concentration pathway, and there's scenarios that use different inputs, like what if we burnt up all the coal in the world? That would be the RCP 8.5. And we did it without any climate policy, with no mitigation. Well, that's just not going to happen. But that's how that scenario shows up. And then there's these other RCP scenarios where it's like, well, what happens if we had fewer people on the planet? Then what would it be? You can see the historical area where we are now. We're nowhere near the RCP 8.5. And you can find that Roger Pielke Jr. and a fellow named Justin Ritchie from BC, if you can believe it, from Green BC, they put together a paper. They did a literature review, and they found almost 17,000 peer-reviewed papers use the now outdated highest scenario emissions, RCP 8.5. And that particular scenario is also most commonly cited in government documents, in the IPCC, and in the US National Climate Assessment. And every day, new papers are published using that RCP 8.5 as the climate catastrophe scenario, even though it's completely wrong. And also the authors say that the representative concentration pathways are supposed to be a plausible, comprehensive, integrated, and consistent description of how the future might unfold, while refraining from a concrete statement on probability. So this is not the crystal ball. And might, as Dr. Moore said, might doesn't mean it will happen. So one of the interesting things that Ritchie and Pielke found is that peak carbon emissions were probably reached in 2019. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but you can see that the least likely, most published scenario is the top one, and yet the most likely scenarios are the bottom ones, and that's where we are now. So we're nowhere near that catastrophe. And this kind of research is quite new, but it's not getting any headlines. You'd think people would be dancing in the streets. Yay, there's no climate emergency. We're all happy, aren't we? You know, our kids don't have to be scared anymore. But it continues. So this is the cover of that document that Pielke and Ritchie wrote. And one of the things that they have pointed out is that these RCP scenarios are not to be compared to each other because all of the assumptions are completely different. And it's scientifically misleading and methodologically wrong to compare one to the other. But if we look at it at Environment Canada's Changing Climate Report, what do we find? Well, comparisons everywhere. So the really hot, bright red one, that's the big emergency one, RCP 8.5. But these are not to be used this way. They should not be compared. They should not be used for policy making. These are not options of how to get to a lower emissions scenario in the world. And you can find that even very famous climate scientists wrongly use these as comparisons. So this was from the University of Calgary. I attended a lecture by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech. She's actually a Canadian. And she and her colleague Ann Stoner wrote the Alberta Climate Future Report that was commissioned under the Alberta NDP government. Anyway, could you just go back? You can see that she's standing in the corner there and she's comparing the RCP 8.5 scenario in the top with, you know, much a backlit emission shot showing how horrible fossil fuels are, and down in the corner the RCP 4.5 with a wind turbine as the solution. But again, they're not to be compared that way. They're not to be used that way. And in fact, from the authors of the RCP scenario, Van Vuren et al., they say that the RCPs should clearly not be interpreted as boundaries for possible developments with respect to emissions and land use. And they are also not meant to be policy prescriptive. Now, one thing that's very concerning to me is if we look at the next slide, there's been some talk today about depopulation and concerns about the ongoing effects of the COVID lockdowns and how many people are dying from lack of treatment, how many people are dying from unintended consequences, overdoses, suicides. One of the deeply concerning things is that some parties might misinterpret the fact that the other RCPs have 3 billion fewer people as part of the equation. And they might misinterpret that and say, oh, maybe we should have 3 billion fewer people on the planet. So you have to think that there are very powerful people like Bill Gates, like the World Economic Forum, who are using these kinds of scenarios to describe the climate emergency and the climate disaster. And they may also be misinterpreting these RCP scenarios as a policy decision-making tool that there should be fewer people on the earth. When we look at Bloomberg Green, they recently published this article saying that the world is moving toward net zero because of a single sentence in the IPCC 1.5 report. Is that how science is done? A single sentence? And it's all based on these scenarios? The IPCC SR 1.5 report is also full of FOLO, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So this probably is where the sudden urge to plant billions of trees comes from. But this is a desperate effort to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is unnecessary and it's damaging because carbon dioxide fertilizes growth. worldwide plant growth. And it also likely stems from the misuse of that RCP 8.5 scenario. There's the hope of planting trees, and there's another thing called BECS, which is bioenergy carbon capture storage, in which they proposed that farmers would plant switchgrass, then they would harvest it, the grass would be burnt for energy production, and the carbon dioxide would be sequestered in the ground. Like, why not just use fossil fuels? Because, you're wasting a lot of agricultural land, and actually biofuels were determined by the UN's own special rapporteur to be a crime against humanity. When there are still people starving in the world, why would you use biofuels? So the result is that millions of children are terrified, public policies have been turned upside down, and green cronies are capitalizing. And I just want to mention also, those green cronies are associated with an organization called the UNPRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. This group is a voluntary group, as most of these things supposedly are, but they have about somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 signatories. They're mostly pension funds, institutional investors, and they have something like $100 trillion in assets under management. And they're all climate crazy, and their fiduciary guru is Al Gore. So these are some of the kinds of pressures in the background against the oil sands, and some of the reasons, I assume, why Premier Kenney has recently said that ESG will be part of oil sands investment, because you're trying to make peace with these people who have so much money and power, but they're very hidden. Like they're right out there in the open, but nobody knows much about them. Like the average people, and even business people. I've asked lots of business people, have you ever heard of the UNPRI? And they're like, oh, what's that? So it's something that you should look into. And what happens when there's bad policy? Oh, could you go back? So poor public policy has very deadly consequences, and we saw that in Texas last week. It's not just about renewables, it's about the fact that the market has been skewed there to the point where no one wants to invest in conventional backup anymore because it's not as profitable as wind and solar, where you can quickly put up a wind and solar farm, get the subsidies, get the tradable renewable energy certificates. So when people say, oh, well, that's the trend of the world, it's only because it's a quick cash grab, but that cash is coming from the pockets of citizens, and who in this case suffered, and many of them died because there was not sufficient conventional power. And when faulty science becomes state policy with no opportunity for open civil debate, millions suffer and die. This is from the book Tombstone, which looks at the Great Leap Forward and the disastrous famine that resulted. And you can see, probably not very clearly, but you'll be able to see on the PowerPoint how they're using the same language then against people who questioned the Great Leap Forward. So anyone who questioned the glorious achievement of a big harvest that didn't exist, they were called deniers. They were called doubters. And just as we see on social media, mobs would struggle the people. They would take the dissenting person, put them in a group, in a circle, where the person was pushed around from person to person till they fell to the ground, and they were kicked and beaten until they either submitted or died. So that's what happens when bad policy becomes state policy. Another example is the Lysenko affair. And Lysenko was one scientist, Trofim Lysenko, in the Soviet Union. And he, it says here, he probably killed more human beings than any other individual scientist in history, because he had very crazy ideas about genetics and plants. He managed to become the favorite of Stalin, and he managed to get his competitors, who actually were scientists with real rational views, he managed to get them sent to the Gulag or executed. And it took years and years until the Lysenko vision of science was disbanded, and they went back to some normalcy. So Now, I started off talking about carbon taxes, and so let's just go back to that for a moment. I think I've established early on that the science is skewed and outdated, and therefore it's unnecessary to have carbon taxes. But, you know, before April 20th, 2020, or April 1st, 2020, we were all paying $192 a ton carbon tax equivalent for fuel taxes. And if that didn't get you out of your car, do you think another $50 will? And if you look around the world, you find that in Norway, back in the 1990s, they had a very stiff carbon tax, but they found that it hardly reduced emissions at all. And they also introduced a carbon tax in Zimbabwe, if you can believe it, and it also wasn't ineffective. So if it doesn't work in these two very diverse countries, one of the richest, one of the poorest, why would it work here? Now, the other thing is, I wrote this before the federal government changed the law on carbon taxes and gave a reprieve to farmers. But I'm saying here, if the carbon tax means Canada's farmers cannot afford to pay for fuel, planting, harvest, grain drying, or cattle and dairy farming, well, who will feed you? So I gave two examples of famines, one being in the Soviet Union, one being in China. But farmers will still be affected by all the other carbon taxes, even if they're getting something of a reprieve. So Judith Curry in 2014 told the US Senate that carbon dioxide is not the control knob that can fine-tune climate. Therefore, of course, a carbon tax is irrelevant. And what can we learn from the story of Lysenkoism? Well, it's simple enough. It just requires that political authorities interfere in science by supporting the dubious scientific ideas of an individual or a group of individuals and continue to do so without correcting the situation, even in the face of radical contradictions with reality, such as millions of deaths. So, since we reached peak carbon emissions in 2019, extreme climate policies like net zero 2050 are not necessary. Burdensome carbon taxes are ineffective, and there's no climate emergency. So since the environment minister's mandate is to use the best available science and to consider the impacts of policy on Canadians, it's time for a thorough review of present climate policy and rejection of those policies that will damage the economy, and especially the policies that hurt food production and harms the mental health of children. So although I am not presenting today as Friends of Science, I do want you to be aware of these two productions we recently did. One with Donna Laframboise, which shows how climate activists are undermining all of your freedoms, and the other one with Dr. Roy Spencer, in which he explains why, the many reasons why there is no climate emergency. Those are sponsored content. You have to pay a fee to watch them or become a member where it's included. But I think they're both very plain language, straight up. Anybody can watch it and make sense of it. And finally, I want to read this long and kind of grim passage, but I think it's really important because when I look at the climate policies being enacted, this is what I see. I see catastrophe. I see famine based on historic issues. We're walking right off a cliff. And this is by Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel Prize for economics. He wrote, "In the terrible history of famines in the world, no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent and democratic country with a relatively free press. We cannot find exceptions to this rule no matter where we look. The recent famines of Ethiopia, Somalia, or other dictatorial regimes, famines in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, China's 1958 to 61 famine with the failure of the Great Leap Forward, or earlier still, the famines of Ireland and India under alien rule. China, although it was in many ways doing much better economically than India, still managed, unlike India, to have a famine, indeed the largest recorded famine in the world. Nearly 30 million people died in the famine of 1958 to 61, while faulty government policies remained uncorrected for 3 years. The policies went uncriticized because there were no opposition parties in parliament, no free press, and no multi-party elections. And indeed, it's precisely this lack of challenge that allowed the deeply defective policies to continue, even though they were killing millions of people every year. And just on one final note, we talked about the lockdowns today. The thing that's coming next is a climate lockdown. And people who write for the World Economic Forum have been sort of posing this, like, isn't it grand that emissions dropped this year by 8%? This is what they're more concerned about than the fact that people's lives were ruined. So then the UNEP is saying, well, every year for the next decade, we should drop emissions 7.6%. So what logical conclusion are these green ideologues going to come to? Climate lockdowns. And this economist named Mariana Mazzucato wrote about that in September of 2020, that will probably be the next thing that has to be instituted. So these are very serious consequences for all of society. On that note, I just want to thank you all for having me here today. And I hope that none of these horrible things happen. Thank you.